Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Astuma Vittishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May our study be vigorous and excellent. May we gain vigor overall and strength. May we not cavil with each other necessarily. And peace, peace, peace be unto all. So we are studying the 18th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. And we left off last week in discovering the three types of happiness. That is, everything is categorized into three areas because what we call nature has these three apparent components, not divisions, components, contributing factors. Whether it is at the one end, the furthest end of the cosmos, whether it is in the area of physics, or whether it is in the area of the psyche, the mind, these three aspects are there. The whole of nature is this combination. How do we get the psychological aspect of a dominating kind of behavior or quality? It is through the conscious mind. When we train the conscious mind, it seeps down into the unconscious area, and we have the capacity, being the Atman, that is, being independent of this mind, we have the choice, like three gears in a car, to move our tendency up from one thing to another. It is the understanding of these three gunas, these three binding elements, that is absolutely necessary, because all action, all words, all speech, everything that comes under the category of action has some blemish somewhere. We cannot ever be 100% sattvic or pure or illumined, because we require the other two components to live. At least a certain percentage has to be retained. And it is not necessary to put these in moral categories necessarily, except for this fact. Why should we give up actions that are of a rajasic nature or tamasic nature? It is because they are not purifying to us. And the goal is to purify the mind to the extent that the truth, the underlying realization of who we are, or the underlying realization of what is there permanently and enduring, behind and underneath everything, can be revealed by itself. So this last chapter, Moksha Sannyasa Yoga, starts off with an interesting structure, just to remind you. It starts off with the theme of renunciation. Just to remind you, renunciation is not giving up actions. Because the question arises, supposing we give up, renounce all activities, then is that feasible? Is it possible? Particularly in this day and age, is it possible? Well, some 5,000 years ago, the same issue came up as it would come up today. No, you can't sit there like a stone. Some action has to be there, even with the best will in the world. Some basic physical activities have to be undertaken in order to live. And so what kind of actions should we do? We should do every action which has as little selfishness as possible contained within it. Any action that is goal-orientated for selfish gains, any action which is, or any renunciation of a type which says, I just won't do anything. I'll be lazy. I'll depend, maybe have a drug dependency. Why do people take drugs or alcohol and fall into a stupor? Because of this tamasic element, but they're not permanently like that. So these conditions are not permanent conditions. And this whole idea of why we should engage the sense organs, why we should engage any pursuit of anything that gives us some pleasure, some happiness, is because our fundamental nature is supremely blissful. So we left off on a stanza which told us that the kind of happiness that is sattvic is very difficult for us in the beginning. Like poison is the strong language used in the beginning. But once we engage in this, that's once we find the inner nature of something and coordinate all our thought and effort and activity toward that, we find increasing joy, increasing happiness. I may have mentioned before, but the famous atheist Ingersoll once challenged Vivekananda and said, the problem with you, religious, spiritual kind of people, I'm paraphrasing, is you don't know how to enjoy life. On the contrary, says Swami Vivekananda, I know how to squeeze every part of the orange of life with the maximum pleasure, with the maximum enjoyment. Ramakrishna described this world as a mansion of mirth. We shouldn't take it in any different way. So it is to increase this enduring pleasure. But typically, we are pursuing things which are in relation to the external world, thinking that objects will give us pleasure, or the pursuit of objects will give us pleasure. In other words, we're simply reacting to the connection with the five senses to the five objects that we find in the universe. On close examination, these objects are waves. On close examination, these waves are divine waves. On close examination, these waves are this God that we are pursuing in spiritual life. And so we start a process of understanding this presence inside these objects. Actually, there's 5 processes. One process is basic religion that has no depth to it. It is to think that God is an object like any other object we pursue, as something that is distant and external to us, with no real connection there, no real understanding. God then becomes to us a mere lawgiver, something that is outside the cosmos. Some people may ask, do you believe in God? And I might honestly have to say, well, I'm an atheist with regard to an extra cosmic creator God. I won't put God outside, but if you put that God inside and pervading everywhere, then yes, it's a different kind of God. So that's the first stage. We tend to say, well, I am here. Where is God? And think there's an absentee God. And therefore we look for this God outside the universe even. This has created many problems because today the culmination of this is religion on the one side, science on the other. Because if God is outside, made the clock, designed the clock called the universe, made it run well, where's the need for a God? It's a self-generating clock, a self-winding clock. And so religion's effort to make a dualism so that they understand, look, we won't have any form of pantheism. We won't make nature self-containing and self-generating. There has to be some entity that has designed it well, that has wound it up well, to the extent that we know every cause that creates every effect. They're called determinism. Backfired against them so that naturalism really prevailed, because naturally the question arises, if the universe works so well, we don't really require any kind of external entity. So that kind of God is a beginning position. The next position then is a realization, maybe a discipline to start with, that what we are seeking is inside everything. The question, what is life, is a question brought up by Erwin Schrödinger, the great physicist. He does a series of lectures, 1938 in Dublin, the Royal Society. And there is compiled in the book, What is Life? And he makes some very insightful observations. But it's a question anyway, regardless of his conclusions. It's a question still being analyzed and debated today. What is life? What is the difference between an assembly of chemicals and things which are organic and a whole composition of organic life that culminates in a thinking, analyzing, speaking, listening man? A you and an I right now. Me talking, you listening. What is it that is doing? And you evaluating it, hopefully, rationalizing it, and imbibing it for any lessons for improvement. What we call happiness and perfection is really the same pursuit. In order to get some fulfillment somewhere, we pursue a certain course of action. But then once we have cultivated a view that this entity is inside everything, it yields to another realization that everything is holistically connected. When you change or tune one thing here, you've tuned it everywhere. And the solution is not in the parts. The solution is in the whole. And the whole exhibits itself in the parts. It's an unfolding or an enfolding process. And this, then we understand that this entity is through everything. And then the realization, there cannot be any two. It is as everything, and of course beyond. So these various positions can be taken. Outside, a starting position. Inside, then through, then as, then beyond. If I said 6, I meant 5 actually, 5 positions. Outside, inside, through, as, beyond. 5 things. 5 approaches. Now, all of them are correct in their own way. When we want to pursue something, we would think that it's something outside. And so that's a natural assumption because everything that we know of is an external thing. So we engaged in the subject of happiness and what kind of categories the various aspects of happiness form. And so just to remind you, yet tat agre visham, it begins, that which is like poison at first, but like nectar at the end. That happiness is said to be sattvika. Just to remind you of what we covered last week. And this is born of the translucence of the intellect due to self-realization. Translucence. That is, the intellect becomes enlightened. Buddha is one of enlightened intellect. This intellect, this understanding has to be illumined. There has to be a luminescence. It's like a light, really. We try to shine it on something external to find what is there. But when we shine it on ourselves, we find out exactly what is there. It's all internal. And then we went on and maybe didn't fully cover the 38th stanza. Vishayendriya sam yogat yatat agre mritopamam pariname visham iva tat sukham rajasam smritam. So, Vishaya Idriya Samyogat, from the contact of the sense organs with the object. This is all our problem. We try to find there's an urge toward pleasure, there's an urge toward happiness, an urge toward power and perfection, and we're looking at it, for it in the objects corresponding to the sense organs. But of course, an analysis, and we covered this on Sunday also, when we look at this properly and engage all the whole arsenal of the Upanishads, it's not, those sense objects are not always there. They're only there when the physical senses are there, but the inward senses still operate. the dissimilarity of that observing entity with the rise and fall of the sense organs. What is that? When the senses withdraw from this external world, if we want to put it this way, a whole internal world opens up for us. We would call this a dream. And then when they all go to bed, as it were, all settle down, then there is a kind of calm and peace that is registered as a dreamless sleep. Remarkably, Bhagavad Gita does not refer to these three states of consciousness. But of course, the Upanishads in so many places make this a very key understanding, evaluation. Why would we pursue something in one phase and not the others? Of course, we would want a happy dream, no doubt. So that happiness which arises from the contact of the senses and their objects, and which, like nectar at first, is a kind of normal position that we want to pursue. But it doesn't give us purity. And if it doesn't give us purity, it doesn't give us fulfillment. And if it doesn't give us fulfillment, we'll be repeating the same effort to fill in the seeming hollows that we find inside, thinking they're the objects will give us all the satisfaction that desire has in our imagination to fulfill. And it's all in the mind. It is all the way we are looking at things. And it seems like nectar at first, but the nectar doesn't last very long. It is not a lasting solution. And then gives us a depression, gives us a hollow, a sense of absence, and sometimes a sense of guilt. But in any event, it doesn't fulfill the long-term pleasure we're looking for. Ultimately, it becomes painful to us. In pursuing pleasure, the irony is we get pain from it. There are, of course, many, many examples we can give of this, but this is held anyway to be Rajasika. See, in pursuing external happiness in the Rajasic way, we are also depleting our energy and our stamina. And it is energy that require for concentrated effort. Because the key to this is to take all the energy that we have as psychic energy, what is described by the yogis as psychic prana, and direct it in a different way. This directed way, different way, is termed by the yogis ojas. Mythology tells us some interesting things. Many people dismiss mythology, mere stories. There's nothing mere about mythology. Mythology tells us some significant things in an easy, comprehensible way. Of course, we're familiar with the agreement that the devas and the asuras, two opposite forces, combined, they wanted to get out this elixir of immortality. Because this is the pursuit. Everybody wants this pursuit. What we call happiness, what we call pleasure, is something that is enduring. What's the point of having it for a moment? We want it to last forever. Is there some nectar that will produce this? It is a pursuit that we find in many, many mythologies throughout the world in many different historical eras. So they make a contract. They're going to churn the milky ocean. That is, they're going to stir up the whole cosmos. And what will they get from it? Well, they'll get some things. They'll get things that they're looking for, amenities. Education, for example, is what they want. Wealth is what they want. Maybe a means of transport, ornaments, these kinds of things. Food, wholesome food, gifts, unlimited gifts. In fact, anything that and everything that the heart desires by churning the milky ocean. And what we find is that normally the rescue of humanity is Vishnu. But by churning this Mount Meru, by churning this great column, they are actually making a big hole. And so they implore Lord Vishnu, Lord, you're preserving, your job is to preserve this universe. Please help us. So he transforms himself into a turtle and makes sure that the abrasion, the augering effect in the earth, doesn't occur. Now, he can't rescue anybody if something unfortunate comes out of the Milky Ocean, and something did. Some poison came out. And Shiva, of course, was the rescuer because Vishnu was already occupied. So they appealed to Shiva. Shiva, why? Because Shiva is the one who is the embodiment of renunciation of all these desires. Shiva is the one great yogi. Shiva is the one who obviously has this dhyaga, this kind of renunciation, this detachment. And that is why he is pure. And so, out of purity and compassion, this poison that comes out, that threatens both the world of the Devas and the Asuras, he takes it and drinks it and creates a blueness in his throat as a result. He gives a rescuing here. This great god Shiva in this context is known as Tyagaraja, the Lord of renunciation. But what are the things that these people want? In theological terms, education, Saraswati, prosperity and wealth, Lakshmi, a means of transport, Airavata, gems and jewelry and possessions, ornaments, if you will, Kaustubha, and the Kamadhenu, that cow of plenty, cow that will fulfill all desires. That's what they want. So we can see that there's great symbolism in this mythology. You see, death is the unknown and unfactored in thing. In getting pleasures, we ignore the fact that this attachment to life has the opposite side of the coin, and that is death. And so the search for immortality is a fundamental search that we have. And so we have to engage in the principle of self-control and renunciation as embodied by Shiva. Renouncing the rajasika, the happiness, the spiritual practitioner should go to the sattvika kind of happiness, should finally transcend it too and merge in the bliss beyond, because that bliss is his own nature. That is why the urge for happiness is there. If we want to find out what is the fundamental source and what is its nature, we have to find evidence for it, signals of it in the working, waking world. One, the pursuit of happiness means that there's a reason for it. What is it? Our nature is bliss. We are not connected with it. And therefore we look for it, even a sense of humor, even a joke, even a laugh. If you want to find out what is the fundamental basis of it, is because the world itself is waves of joy, if you want to put it in this way. These are waves that come and go, a kind of play of waves taking place, and behind it, this great bliss. And so let us look at the next one. Yadagre cha ubande cha sukham mohanam atmanaha nidra lasya pramadotam tat tamasam udartam. See, this happiness, or that which agre at first deludes the self, both at the beginning and at the end, and which arises from sleep, sloth, and miscomprehension, that is declared to be tamasika. And we've already touched on this, using examples of delighting in prolonged sleep, delighting in laziness, and delighting in imbibing in those things that produce it. Today, with the COVID virus, governments are reluctant to close down alcohol sales. If you know anything about your history, this so-called evil of alcohol was brought up in the 1920s, I think it was, in America, where they put a law in of prohibiting the sale of this alcohol. They thought they would reform society in a wonderful way. And today, of course, one of the greatest drugs that does the greatest harm is alcohol. Now, if they were, I'm told yesterday, supposing in the COVID-19 regulations, they said, let us close all alcohol sales outlets, there would be a riot in Ireland, probably throughout the whole of Europe and America and so on, because this is the one thing that keeps people going. And yet, commensurate with it, consuming alcohol now in the domestic environment increases cases of child abuse measurably, increases domestic violence. People go mad with it. And yet we have to use the art of seeing the subtle positive aspects of it. One question before we began here was about the principle of sublimation. And I mentioned that Sri Ramakrishna, when he went about in a carriage, used to salute three things. We'll put them in any very varied order we like, but all places of worship he would salute. And then all women he would salute because he saw them as the embodiment of the Divine Mother of the universe. He taught us this great lesson to value women highly. This whole problem in the 20th and 21st centuries, which is still there today, of this inequality in gender, and particularly in third world countries, we still find it, where women are second-class citizens, third-class citizens. Even people who have great education, seemingly, but who are entrenched in a backward culture, think that the woman in a relationship, in a partnership, or in a marriage is somebody who needs to obey the husband, somebody who is subservient, somebody who is inferior. Of course, women are naturally more active. You ask anybody who is in that household environment, who is the one who finds your socks, then you'll find it is the woman, no doubt. But you see, this other component that Ramakrishna used to salute was every inn, that is, in the Irish language, every pub, every place where drink is served, because it reminded him of the drunkenness of spiritual ecstasy, the reeling drunkard. If he saw a reeling drunkard on the street, he would go arm in arm and dance with him. It reminded him of his own saturation of bliss that he had. And so we can transform any of these things, but if this transformation doesn't take place, we're left with tamas. We're left with darkness, ignorance, depression, and all the social problems that go with it. The Sattvika and Rajasic people, they know how to shake off sleep and sloth at the call of duty. In emergency, they're there. They rally round. They don't go into despondency. But the tamasic person would delight in things like prolonged sleep, dozing for hours together, essentially laziness, dullness. And this could be a behavior forming amidst the COVID virus, with nowhere to go and no schedule and no program. People withdraw and go into a depression where they cannot move, stunned as it were. So this is something we have to be aware of, particularly in these times, to elevate this into something active. Fortunately, the media that we're using here is a way of communicating with people. I was reading today how psychologists are extremely worried because with this isolation, the human requirement, the human need for touch and being in touch, that is likely to diminish. And children might grow up with this very, very comforting and very, very necessary, nurturing aspect of this human dimension, this dimension of touch. And then, of course, being in touch, where we become isolated more and more, schedule all gone. There are several people who have contacted me saying that they have this great problem because they have no work to do. They might still be employed, but in their isolation, they've now got used to it and they don't know what to do. They are bored to tears because they have no inclination to take up a book, to take up a study. For many people, this is a great opportunity to learn something new every day, to take up a new hobby, take up a new interest, become more active and more diverse than ever. So we have to have this idea that three gears are there, and we can independently and have to shift these gears up from the lowest aspect of tamas to rajas, activity, to sattva. And whenever we see this slip, we do it again. It's not a permanent condition. It's a condition that invites and requires us to employ change. Sri Ramakrishna tells us this, since we have a commentary here from him. The hemp smoker believes that his inebriation is a form of spiritual ecstasy. You know, people go to India and think, oh, these yogic spiritual people, see what they do? They go and they light up a little thing and they puff away and they share it around and they go into this daze and so on. And this is spirituality. We even had some question actually last Wednesday from a study group that said, you see, I have a physical condition and have been suffering with back and this and that, the other. And I find that if I take marijuana, it relieves the pain and puts me in a good mood and makes me more enthusiastic and so on. Can this not be applied in spiritual life? Can it not be applied to also elevate the mind, just as meditation might do and so on? And I told him that the subject was covered. These rasa yogis are there, covered by Patanjali because it's his subject matter. But of course, what he's saying is, it creates a dependency and is now in this category of this tamas or even rajas, either one of the two. And so while it might be good when used wisely as a medication, it is nothing to do with spiritual life. And if not carefully controlled, everything to do with dullness and dependency, the whole idea of dependency. The idea of dependency is there in tamas, dependency on either sleep or sloth or depression or substance abuse. And the dependency comes in the rajas, dependent on filling the gap of desire from outside, a gap that I feel inside because I haven't explored my own nature in depth and discovered this area of sublime joy. So now, na tad asti pradivyam ava dive divesho va punaha sattam prakriti jaya muktam yad ebhi shat tribir gunahe. There is no being at all on earth. And when we consider beings, we are talking of the highest to the lowest, from Brahma to a clump of grass, as is classically put. No being on earth or again in heaven among the devas, among all the various unseen entities and elements, and amongst the glories and the angels and so on, if you want to put it in this theological way, that is liberated from the three gunas born of Prakriti. Not even Brahma itself. Although the creator, of course, is the highest of all the Jivatmans, is still bound by the gunas of Prakriti, with the only thing it will be that not experiencing the death, other than the great Prakriti Laya, the great dissolution, and the greatest power that this God is endowed with is called this Prakriti Laya, or the identification actually with the cosmos itself. And his distinction is that he's not bound to be born again, not like us. He's having a final, he is having his final reincarnation, of course, That's the idea of it. And at the close of the prevailing kalpa or eon, where everything goes into a state of singularity, he enters into this krama mukti, or this gradual liberation, then gets beyond these three gunas. The current cosmological model of a Big Bang is preceded by a singularity. It is this singularity, this ultimate generalization, that these great yogis pick up and understand, that everything is resolved into a grand generalization. Whether we believe in the cosmological model or not, we can see how everything that evolves has to go back into an involutionary state, just like breathing out and breathing in. So we can view it now in a cyclical way rather than a linear way. And so any cyclic model of cosmology that is available are sort of on the right track, compatible with this. But this is the idea. We start off from a potentiality, a causal aspect. Don't forget, everything that happens on the microcosm happens on the macrocosm, and vice versa. And so in our conscious life, we see how this consciousness that is divided into people and places and events and scenes and a sense of individuality with an individual body and mind yields to a more subtle environment of a dream state where many egos exist, and we can live like a king with a queen in a palace for 1,000 years, and it is as real as anything else, having the same components of time and space and causality, and how that can go then into a causal aspect. In terms of bodies, the causal is called a causal body. The dream is called a subtle body. In other words, where the mind is alive, but no physical body or sense of physicality is there. And then ultimately, the physical aspect, the physical consciousness is there, mental consciousness is there, and a causal consciousness is there. It is the same process. If it wasn't like that, we could have no faith in the constant laws of the universe. Now, how do we get this liberation? Or I should make a commentary here by Sri Ramakrishna. The sadhaka has to struggle hard against the base nature. It is after a prolonged endeavor that he gets into samadhi. Samadhi is not bought cheaply, because in samadhi, every trace of ego has gone. There's no trace left. The ego, of course, is born of these three evolutionary components, these gunas, and it doesn't disappear easily. We are born in the world repeatedly because of this persistence of the ego. So none is exempt from this. Now, how do we now get out of this? How do we transcend these gunas? How do we get into the state of liberation? And bear in mind that what we're calling freedom is commensurate and synonymous with happiness. Happiness, freedom, perfection, these can all be considered synonymous terms. So now we go on to a different subject matter. Having laid out now the principle of renunciation, having laid out the necessity to be active, not to renounce everything, but only to renounce the things that won't give us purity of mind, having laid out the different aspects of happiness, and now the next thing is how to get this perfection and happiness. We start off now with a structure that has to be balanced, because the foundation that we have and that where our efforts at spiritual discovery begins is here and now in a social context. And the subject of tonight's talk anyway was happiness. I forget exactly what the title was, but happiness in a social context was the meaning of it, basically. Or happiness and the social context. So we begin with the basic structure. And where is this leading to us? We're going to jump a few stanzas and tell us where this is leading us, and then go backwards. So we're going to actually go to The 45th stanza, Sve Sve Karmani Abhirataha Samsitim Labate Narha Swakarma Nirataha Sitim Yata Vindati Tachranu. Devoted each to his own duty, man attains the highest perfection. How engaged in his own duty he attains perfection, he tells in the next stanza. He says, Yata pravritye bhutanam yana sarvam idam tatam swakarmana tam abhyarcha siddhim vindati manavaha. He, from whom is the evolution of all beings, by whom all this is pervaded, worshipping him with his own duty, man attains perfection. In a nutshell, all our activities, all our duties, in other words, whatever is on our plate, all the application of our talents, our skills and abilities, all of our tendencies are drawn toward acts of worship. Every action should be in the framework of karma yoga. Every action is a duty which we are required to fulfill, and nobody else can or should fulfill it. So, this is our worship. What is our spiritual life? What is our spiritual direction? Taking on board what we have to do, what we are designed to do, is, as it were, where we fit in the jigsaw of life, carrying it out to perfection as a worship, as a sacred activity. This is the way to perfection. But what will our duty be? Now we go back to the stanza. So before we go through this, many people inquiring about Hinduism, particularly from the Abrahamic backgrounds, will ask, Hindus believe in the sacredness of all life. They believe in the sacredness in rivers. They believe in the sacredness of the mountains. And by the way, when we say Hindu, what we're talking about is those who take the philosophical aspects of Hinduism called Vedanta. This Bhagavad Gita is a treatise on this Vedanta philosophy and classified after every chapter as an Upanishad, Yoga Shastra. So this is not Hindu in a sectarian way. But those people who are asking this question will take it in this way. So Hindus will worship all of these things. Hindus have such an ethos of the sacredness of life, and yet their social system is downright evil. Because don't they believe in the caste system? So a lot of confusion has to be cleared up, because this next stanza is telling us about a fourfold aspect within society. But the key to this and subsequent stanzas will be found in this: Swabhava Prabhavaya. Swabhava Prabhavaya. Born of their own nature. This has nothing to do with the hereditary caste system. So let us give some explanation. This is a universal thing that has to be adopted really for the whole of society if we want society to function well. And it is not unique to the Indian subcontinent. We find it almost everywhere. There are references to it everywhere. I think there is a reference that we can pick up here. A reference actually made by Gerald Hurd, a famous writer, in his book, Man the Master. So it was written a long time ago, 1942. But there's emphasis, he emphasizes the need for a quadri-type organization of society. He writes like this: it would seem that there have always been present in human community 4 types of strata of consciousness. We have already spoken, he says in his book, of the first level. These are the eyes or antennae, the emergent spheres and sensitivities. Below the eyes are the hands, And behind the forebrain are the motor centers, the two mental classes below the seers, the upper and the lower middle classes, the politician and the technician. It is to them that is mainly due our present crisis. The one, by its great advances of administration is in social instruments, has made it possible for the monster states to exist, and so for their unresolved internal stresses to become more acute. In other words, by acknowledging four components in society and by not putting these in an equal and equivalent context in a balanced way for the good of society as a whole, with one dominating the other, we find a disaster. For the society to run smoothly, four components have to work in synchronism. It is necessary everywhere to have selfless people involved in dedicated work. We see this more than ever in the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic that we have. People now are referred to in war terms. That is, people on the front line is the expression. Doctors, nurses, people involved in healthcare, hospitals, who are risking their lives. I might even say, you see, that there are people just in supermarkets, although they're protected by a glass shield in front or some kind of shield in front, still they're in contact with people on a daily basis more than anybody. But particularly those people who are school teachers, all the schools are open here. School teachers are on the front line, healthcare workers on the front line. We require dedicated people, and in this modern day and age, unfortunately, where a profession is made, for example, school teachers will make a career out of school teaching, not understanding the vocational aspect of this. Teachers, nurses, doctors, all these people are people who are living a dedicated life, not worried too much about the career or monetary rewards with it. Rather than being self-serving people, they're people prepared to serve society in a selfless way. Now, the old classification like this was in this particular stanza and mentions the other three as well. So it's important to understand what we mean by them. Brahmana kshatriya visham Shudranam cha param tapa karmani pravibhaktani svabhava prabhave gunahe. The duties of, or the activities we might say, and duties of these four classes. These are termed Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras. O scorcher of foes, these are distributed according to the gunas, that is, their inherent skills, talents, abilities, propensities, born of their own nature, not born from their father's nature or mother's nature or their ancestors' nature, born of their own nature. Now, of course, we could have a discussion. Is their nature descended from biological DNA? And the answer is physical nature, yes, but psychic nature, no. Their behavioral aspect, no. And research has told us that what we call guna and karma, what we can translate as nature and nurture, are almost 50-50 each, the equivalent. This has come out in identical twin studies. So what do we mean by that? What we call nature is what we call guna. What we have from previously carried forward, creating an individual, even in the 9 months of being in the womb. We are told that these are the most important 9 months in your whole life. And then the reaction, therefore, to your environment in the form of parents and so on, will be the nurture side of it. And so this is what we call karma. Both are given the opportunity for transformation. So people are born with certain tendencies, and these tendencies fall into 4 different types. We have just discussed the Brahmana, that is, those who are dedicated. But what about those who are required to keep law and order, administration, defense, and so on? Then you have to have the Kshatriya, the military administrative sector. The civil service, if you will, although some of it will fall into a different category. And then we have to have the vast majority of people. These are wealth earners. These are people involved in industry, commerce, agriculture. And then we have to have a provision for the unskilled labor. It was understood in the ancient days that these four sectors, these four tendencies, born of their own nature, that means in the same family you could have all four castes in the same family. So you can see how this has been distorted, unfortunately. And then the added complication has been there, tribal people being classified as untouchables. That's Mahatma Gandhi called Haryans, God's chosen people, children of God. See? So these social distinctions, when we make these in a discriminatory way and cling on to all the exaggerated biases and all the discriminations that we can have along these lines, we find that behavior, that approach clearly falls into the aspect of rajas and tamas. The sattvic aspect of this is the coordination of this is absolutely necessary for society. And General Hurd's comment is similar to that of Vivekananda, who felt that in different periods of history, one or the other will dominate. For example, communism, the Shudras dominated, and probably, and to some extent still do in socialist countries. That aspect is there. In dictatorships, see, it is a Kshatriya that would dominate. In areas of capitalism, it is that the Vaishya is dominating. So there needs to be this balance, and this balance comes in how do you avoid the extremes of capitalism, the extremes of socialism, is to understand the coordination of all these contributes toward dharma. And the individual contribution is called swadharma. The individual contribution that is made in a selfless way for the good of society, that is for the harmonizing aspect. When we breach these, when we cross the lines, then we have social discord. What has this got to do with spiritual life? Well, as I mentioned, or as Sri Krishna mentions, it is by engaging all your activities, performing them as a worship, that we get this perfection, this freedom. So this aspect of Swabhava is another name attributed to Prakriti or the Maya Shakti inherent in Ishvara. And as we mentioned, this cosmic reality is constituted of the three gunas. The variation of these in karma is based on the variation of the gunas. Where do we get these varna from, these castes? From variation in the gunas. We would prefer, therefore, to substitute this term, English term caste, by saying different aspects or duties or components that should be harmoniously knitted together. These actions, in turn, whether they're good or bad, form what we call samskara, psychologically, impressions on the mind. And the samskaras get themselves refined. They go on to modify the nature or the svabhava, the flavor or the intention of the individual, the drive behind each individual. That karma and svabhava, these are inseparable. And this is a fact, ever to be borne in mind. So the varna or the grade of evolution of a jivatman is based on this svabhava or nature. Actually, for us to contribute or for us to evolve spiritually, we have to go through these four types of skills and actions. And more than ever, the strength of the Kshatriya is necessary, but we have to see what does it mean? What are the characteristics of all of these particular things? So Varna Dharma is nothing other than a reading of the design or the plan of nature at all levels in general, and of course at the human level in particular. But the distinctiveness of each of these, as evinced by its particular role or duties for dharma, this comes now in this next stanza. Shamodamas tapaha shocham shantir ajavam evacha jnanam vijnanam astikyam brahma karma svabhavajam. So there are certain qualities that make for a Brahmin. Don't think I'm born a Brahmin, say, and therefore I should be honored, or I should not be touched, or all of these kinds of things that come into Orthodox religion. No, you cannot be a Brahmana, and you can be a Brahmana as one of others in the same family. You cannot be such a person unless certain qualities are there. What are these qualities? These are qualities that we aspire for. The first is samaha, shamaha, serenity. Serenity is a state of mind where we have serene emotional intelligence. We react in a same way. We are not upset. We take something and detach emotionally to the extent that we have a serene mental frame regardless of all the things that impinge from the outside. Because you see, if we don't have that serenity of mind, if we react, what we call a reaction will normally be an overreaction. You can compare it in a wave-like way when there's a big tsunami versus some gentle waves. You can see the vast difference in nature. Obviously, you prefer gentle waves. If you go on holiday, you don't say, let's go to enjoy a tsunami. So serenity has to be there, but the central theme, really, of this whole Brahmana characteristic would be self-control. Self-control is the key. And so the self-control is this dhammas, self-restraint. Self-restraint means that the first reaction is there, no doubt. It is observed, but then a controlled reaction is put in that is of a higher quality, that produces the serenity that has gone before. So self-restraint, self-control is necessary. That is the strength of will in order to restrain yourself. And where does it come from? There's a sequence here. It comes from austerity, what is called tapas. Don't forget, in the 17th chapter, tapas comes in three ways. Physical restraint has to be there. Speech has to be there. Control of speech and control of mind. These three things constitute austerity. Oh, how do we do this? What do we mean by this? The key element of this physical is purity. Purity of worship, having a love of God, but purity, physical purity as well, and controlling all the senses. We find earlier in this Bhagavad Gita that there's a psychological process that outlines our decline. It starts with the senses, allowing the senses to brood on objects and allowing the inner senses to follow. So to control that, we control the internal desire of it. Purity is another thing. Purity, of course, is everything. Forgiveness involves forgetting as well. We can say, I forgive you, but do you forget? It's not so easy. And also uprightness, knowledge, realization, belief in hereafter. These are the duties or activities of the Brahmanas born of their own nature. And next week we'll go on to discuss this in greater detail and go to the characteristics of the Kshatriyas, what are the characteristics of the Vaishyas and the Shudras. And then we come to this critical conclusion that by doing all these activities in our own context, that is, with our own swadharma, our own particular part, our own particular design contribution in the overall design, through this, we will get our freedom. So we take this now and see if there are any practical components from this small talk on the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, this study. Is there anything that we can take with us? Certainly, this element of self-control, this element of revaluing the whole of life, this understanding of the three gunas is a highly practical subject. And so I hope in this coming week, you'll take some practical lessons from this and implement it as part of a kind of internal training program that is progressively directed in a higher and nobler way for the benefit of all. We leave off this with a wish for peace, peace, peace to all. Om Shanti, 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 peace, peace, peace be to all.